On Instagram, we are live on YouTube, and we are going to be talking about some pretty cool things about changes happening in Japanese culture today. If you can't hear me, please let me know in the comments. If you can, let me know in the comments where you're from, and would love to hear and learn about you guys. We're going to be talking about Japanese culture today, and you know, I think it's funny lately. Our social media has kind of taken off a little bit, and we got the great comments, and I think most of you guys, we are like, yay, we're trying to tell people about Jesus. We want to see disciples made. How people really understand who Jesus really is, and that's great. And then we have some people who come in and they're like, hey, so you shouldn't be pushing your beliefs on people. You are not you're going to you shouldn't change Japanese culture. So they're like, hey, you need to stop doing what you're doing. And so there's different ways to look at this. One second, I'm having a little bit of an error here. Let's see here. Let's go over here. We'll do that. We'll drop that. Oh no, we're having an issue on YouTube. System status poor. Okay, well, we are going to try to take care of that some other way. Okay, great. So, thanks for watching from Dallas. We've got people moving to Japan next week. Vancouver, moving to Hokkaido. We've got a ton of people jumping on today. But first, I want to talk to you about what is culture, right? Like, what is culture? Because people, sometimes as we're engaging online and talking about our work and what we're doing, they're like, you shouldn't be forcing your beliefs. Japan has their own culture, and you shouldn't go corrupt their culture or whatever, okay? So that's a very interesting concept. And it sounds kind of nice, right? Like, don't mess with people. But the thing is, and I'm pulling this, okay, I'm a millennial, okay, I'll claim it. But culture, according to Google, is the ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. Ideas, customs, and social behavior of a particular people or society. The problem is, culture changes. And, we can see that if you take everything in the United States and flip it, in Japan and flip it, and I were to ask you and say, hey, what is American culture? Well, there's a few things that are like the overarching, yeah, this is true about everybody, right? But then there is the things that are different based on your region and based on your generation. So, for example, if in the States, I want to show you this slide here. But in the States, for example, you've got different generations. So let's go over here, and we'll come over here. So in the States, you've got the oh, that's not showing up. Oh. Well, in the States, you've got different generations. You've got, your baby boomers, you've got Gen X, you've got millennials, Gen Z, and now you've got Gen Alpha, right? And there's different generations that are, there's different generations that do different things. And, if you were a 20-something-year-old, 30-something-year-old, and said, hey, so... all right, we're going to fix that echo. Sorry about that. If you were to say, hey, what is American culture? Well, the values that, say, someone that's a millennial or Gen Z or even now Gen Alpha, because that's, I believe, 2013 to 2022, Here, we'll do that. We're having all kinds of technical issues today. There we are. Okay, and we're good. Okay, so first off, in Japan, I want to give you a few anchor points to kind of anchor these issues that are being talked about today. So, for example, if we talked about America, and again, I'm going to kind of throw this back and forth to America and the Japan, because once you start thinking about it in those terms, it becomes a little bit more understandable. So if we were to say, America, well, why is America so strict on security, and why is the NSA spying on everybody, and why is, airport security so strict now? Well, we would have to say, okay, we need to point to a definite time in history called 9/11 when there was this terrible attack that happened. Lots of people died, airplanes were used. And after that, the country had to adjust. They had to change. Well, there are some defining moments like that in Japan. So we're going to talk about those first, and I've got them pulled up right here. So there was a thing called the bubble. Now, that sounds very exciting. A bubble. Okay, like, are you blowing bubbles now? No. The bubble was basically a time period from like 1986 to like 1991 where there was a hyperinflation of land prices. And then in 1991, that collapsed and the economy collapses from 1991. And that leads to what is commonly called the lost decade, or now it's really considered the lost 20 years. The economy crashes, lifetime employment went out the window for a lot of people. There was a lot of mistrust of the system after that. So that happens. 1995, 4 years later, there's a great earthquake, the Hanshin earthquake. Literally, like, roads and bridges falling over in the middle of the city. Like, I think like 6,000 people. There were 6,000 fatalities. It was bad, okay? And so we go through this time. And then, just like everybody else, yes, the bubble economy. And then, just like everybody else, we get the iPhone, okay, in 2008. And then that kind of revolutionizes communication. There's some online stuff that's already been going on in Japan, but then that culture is accelerated, the online forums, and, that really is what pushed Twitter, when it was called Twitter, to the forefront in Japan, was this online forums and communities happening. And then the iPhone and the internet accelerates this process. So all of that goes forward. And then in 2011, there's the Great Tohoku earthquake, where like 18,000 people are dead or missing, and like all this stuff. So that is some history. So there's these anchor points where these shifts happen in the country, they happen in what's going on, and because of that, people start to think differently, believe differently, act differently, and so in that way, Japanese culture among people changes, right? Because it's the ideas, customs, and social behavior of people. Social behavior changes when, what was considered normal in your economy crashes, normal goes out the window, thinking changes, the ideas change, behavior changes, all these things change. So we have to keep those things in mind. There's one other thing that I think sometimes gets overlooked in this, and I know this is a little bit technical, it sounds like a history lesson, but we're going to anchor our discussion moving forward in this. So just bear with me for a little bit longer. But the other thing is there was a shift in the educational system in Japan, how they were educating people, and it lasted for 20 years. It started in 1986 and went all the way to 2006, roughly about 20 years, when they had an educational reform. They said, before that, they're like, hey, we're putting too much stuff into academics. We need to lower the pressure on our students. They moved to a 5-day school week instead of a 6-day school week. Now, there are still people who go to school on Saturday, some on Sunday. That's not to say that everything changes, but these gradual shifts started to happen. And they called it yutori kyoiku. Basically, more like a relaxed education. That started in the mid-1980s, 1986, and it went all the way through to 2006. So if you were born, in the 80s, all the way up to the 2000s, in Japan, you have gone through this educational mindset that was changed for Japan as a whole. It was the Ministry of Education, the government said, this is how we're going to do things now. Now, again, there's some of the old that's still left over, and now they're trying to make other changes as well. But they made these changes. So people that were born in the 1980s, so if you're born in 1986, that means you are currently 38, right? 86, yeah, 86, 96, 06, 16, yeah, 38. You're 38 years old. You are the product of an entirely different educational system than what was in place before. So you have to keep these things in mind. Now, the Yutori Sedai, the Yutori generation, typically goes from about 1986-ish to like 2004. That's what they say is that generation. Now, you could have been born before that a little bit because that's when the educational system kicked in. So say you were born 4 or 5 years before that, like 1980s. 1980s, when you're 6 years old, the educational system changes, you go through that. So basically anybody like 42 and under went through a different educational system, and their thinking is different. And so if you're like mid-20s to 40s, your thinking is different from people that's 45 and older in Japan. And so that really changes the mindset and the thinking, which again means there's changes in culture. So I want to talk to you about that. There's a generational gap going on. So most of you are probably familiar with like the workplace culture. What are some of the things that are changing? So for example, most people are like, Japan, everybody works all the time. They dedicate their lives to the company, blah, 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 blah. That was true till probably about maybe 20 years ago, because the people who started in this new educational system, one, their educational thought patterns change. They've experienced the bubble economy collapse, and the stability in long-term employment is gone. So if you were born between 1970 and like 1980, you're basically considered the 就職氷河期世代. And that is basically the employment ice age generation. What happened is that if you were born in 1970, 1991, you're 21 years old, you're going into the workforce, the bubble pops, you don't have lifetime employment. And so those people born between 1970 and 1980, they really struggled to find good long-term employment. Again, there are exceptions, so we've got to keep that in mind, okay? There's always exceptions to everything going on, but they struggled because, they were promised this package of goods, the bubble economy is great, we're going through, it's just growth, and then they're like, actually, sorry, man, our company just went out of business, like, you don't have a job. And they're like, what? And they're bounced from job to job, part-time work, and it just messes up. If you were born 5 years before that, you're the bubble generation, and you experience the affluence, because as you're coming in, money is so abundant, it's like water, people are spending like crazy, it's super rich and luxurious, and then the bubble pops. So if you're born between like 1970 to 1980, you didn't see that money. You heard about it. You saw other people enjoy it. When it was time for you to enjoy it, it was gone. And so there's a stronger distrust of the system. A lot of people are struggling more from this generation. There's a guy who is coming to our church. He's 50 now, in his 50s. He would have been born in the 70s. And he works a full-time job. He makes hardly anything. He works another part-time job on the side. And he just works. He's not even married. He had some sickness and just like trying to pay the bills. And it's hard. Because the economy changes. So, and the culture changes. Now, 1986, they're like, hey, maybe we should relax our educational system. This is before the bubble pops. There's still money flowing everywhere. They implement the changes, the bubble crashes, but the educational system still stays in place. Now, these people are more likely to not want to work overtime. That's a thing that's really common these days. They're like, young people don't want to work overtime. We've got some friends that live in our neighborhood. He works for the government. She works for a TV station. And they work overtime, but not as much. And we were at a barbecue the other day, and we were talking to them about that. And they said, hey, so, I was asking them about, the culture there and like the working late. And she said, people of our generation, I think they're in their mid-30s, which would put them right in that yutori generation where the educational reforms kicked in. They're like, people our age and younger, they don't tend to stay late as much. People older than that, in their 40s and 50s, pushing 50, they'll stay at their workplace until, 10 p.m. And I was like, why do you think that is? We were talking about that. She's like, I think probably their families just function without them so much now. They're so used to it that they don't have a place to belong at home. Like their wife takes care of everything. Their kids are used to not seeing their dad. Like they have a place to belong at work. If they go home, they wouldn't know what to do with themselves. But those educational reforms, we're seeing people spend a lot more time, family and thinking about that. Now, that's not to say that people aren't working overtime, okay? So please take everything I'm saying with a grain of salt. It's just that, saying everybody in Japan works all the time is not true. It is a fallacy. I could take you out. If you come to Recon, I will show you this. We could stand on the street at 5:30 in the afternoon, and I'll show you all the white-collar guys getting on the train going home. 5:30 in the afternoon. Now, you tell me, is that overworking? There they go. They're all walking home, going home. No. So there is some companies still do that. Sometimes it's a rough patch. There is some of that still here, but the culture is changing. So you have to keep that in mind as you're thinking about Japan. Someone's just mentioned in the comments, I heard that they go out drinking. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't, And so, again, it's like, let's try to debunk some stereotypes here. Because if you just apply this label, it really doesn't account for these generational differences. And it'd be like saying, oh, you're from America. You must be like a baby boomer. And like, yeah, no. So you have to consider that. Now, in the workplace, though, there is this generational gap in thinking and mentality. And so that does lead to some friction in what's expected, like a late 40s, 50-year-old person who's been in the workforce for 30 years and a person who's coming in or has about 5-10 years of experience. They're like, yeah, that's old. So in Japan, we call it Showa. That was not our previous emperor, but the one before. In Japan, they number the years based on the emperor's rule, and his period was called the Showa period. The Showa, Heisei, I'm a Heisei child, and then right now it's Reiwa. We're in Reiwa 6 now. That's the current emperor's reign. So that in Japan we say that's the Showa way of doing things. We're the corporate samurai, we're this, we're that. That's Showa. Nowadays, the Yutori generation and people who came through that, they're considered soft. They don't have any ambition. They're just like, yeah, whatever. They tend to believe more of what they are told. I really wish I could show you this screen I have pulled up. It's not coming up, but there's a whole. It's a Japanese marketing company, okay, and you go through. So it's just like yeah, these are the generations, and here's what their thought processes are and what they believe. Because as a marketer, they're like, we need to be able to speak the right language to communicate to these different generations. Like, if you're trying to sell a life insurance policy, you're probably going to be targeting this age range. They make this much, they think like this. How much more so if we're trying to communicate the gospel and trying to get inside of the way people think and figure out how are they processing information? How are they going to interact with ideas? That's what we're dealing with. So, yeah, we are seeing that as well. Another thing is a shift that's happening is communication styles are starting to change. I was listening to a Japanese book the other day, and I listened to audiobooks, and he was talking about the need to move away from indirect communication. And that sounds kind of like, whoa, what? But he was talking about, in copywriting and as you're writing stuff, he was like, take what you're saying in Japanese, he's talking in Japanese, take what you're saying in Japanese, translate it into English, and if they don't understand it, then it's too vague. Simplify it, make sure it's understandable. So the example he was using was for a medicine bottle. Sometimes on the labels, it would say something to the effect of, it is better to refrain from putting this bottle in direct sunlight. He's like, if you translate that, that's how it would sound in Japanese, essentially. He said, don't say that. If you say that in English, they'd be like, what are you trying to say to me? He said, no, you say, avoid direct sunlight when storing this product. Everybody understands it's more direct. And the younger generation is favoring more of this direct communication style. Now, that doesn't mean, though, that you can completely throw out the old, because this isn't an either-or paradigm, it's a both-and. So people who go into the workforce, they're having to work with the older generation. They know how this communication, indirectness, and go beat around the bush kind of style goes. So they're saying, hey, okay, how do I communicate this in a way that makes sense to these people and their way of thinking? Again, this is more current people dealing with older people. So these generational gaps are changing how we communicate. So as we're, say, communicating the gospel, we're going to have to think and say, hey, this person is 20 years old. How they are going to process the gospel and information and make decisions is going to be wildly different from somebody that's mid to late 40s and older. And the way we converse with them might be a little bit more indirect, saying, okay, well, maybe this. And the older person is going to be thinking a lot more about the indirectness and going this way, that way. How is this going to go? But then the younger person's a little more direct, and they appreciate it. So these are cultural shifts, and so it's going to impact how we are doing the gospel and ministry and communicating these things in Japan. So strong generational gaps are occurring. So if you come into Japan, a lot of the literature, they're like, hey, Japan is a group-oriented society. And it is true, okay, to a degree. So you can't take one thing and just slap it all over everything. So for example, I think Chris is on here, Chris Wilson, she's in Ohio. She was visiting us because she works for Reaching Japan now. If you sign up for Recon, she's going to call your references. So she does that for us. But she and her son Eli were visiting us, and we were walking through town. There was a political protest going on, guys with megaphones shouting, saying stuff about the current government, right beside this this cosplay thing going on, and there's like police everywhere, and it was just like a mess. It was like crazy, okay? And, that's Japan now. It's not just everybody's quiet, everybody keeps to themselves. I've literally seen in our city, one group was trying to make a political speech, and then there was another group with megaphones standing in front of them, shouting back at them, okay? So, it's not all that it's made out to be. And I think if there's one takeaway that I want you to have from this, it's that there are overarching principles that apply to most people in Japan. But then you can't just apply this persona, this is what Japanese people are, to every single person and say, this is how it is. Because their thinking is different. Generationally, it's different. Their experiences are different. So as we communicate the gospel, it really takes maybe a little bit of time to say, tell me about you. Tell me about what you've walked through, what you've experienced, what's going on in your life. Instead of assuming that we know this person and their experience and what they've walked through, saying, tell me more about you. Tell me more about you. And starting the conversation there to really learn and go at it with that. So I would definitely encourage you to not only read books, but experience Japan and see it, and not just apply, hey, I saw in Japan that they XYZ. Don't say that. When you come to Japan, don't say that. I want you to keep your eyes open, keep your mouth shut for a few days, and say, what's going on here? What do I really see? And try to get those filters off so that way you can get through. So I'm going to go through these comments and see what kind of questions we've got. There was somebody talking about Frank a minute ago. But if you've got a question, please drop it in the comments. I know we've got like 20 some odd people watching over on Instagram and then another few on YouTube. But if you've got a question, I would be more than happy to take those. I know we had some technical difficulties earlier. We got people from New Zealand, etc. All right, I'm not even sure Buddhism is actually believed anymore in Japan, just optics habits, but I've never been there. You know more, so I could be sounding ridiculous now. So some of this, it's a yes and no. Again, there's some generational stuff there, because, some people, it's like a lot of Americans might go to church on Christmas and Easter. They're not Christian. They celebrate Christmas. They're not Christian. It's just part of the culture. But then, there's people that are like, I have something going on in my life. I'm going to go to the shrine and ask for a favor. So it's this like humanistic, self-centered, I'm the center and I need the gods to help me view. And in Japan, they say, komatta toki no kamidanomi, requesting something from the gods when you're in trouble or you need help. And that is typically how a lot of it is. Now, as people get older, they're like, maybe I need to start thinking about the afterlife and all that. So we went through a little bit of an audio spell there, but I think we got that taken care of. What gets me with people who make these criticisms, yeah, people are very interesting in how they interact. All right. What's our next question? Cannot wait to start evangelizing. Great. In Saitama, awesome that you're here. Changes in culture. What's a typical middle class wage per hour and how many hours are typical? So that's depends on what you define as middle class. In Japan, they really think that the myth in Japan is that everybody's middle class, and that is a complete lie. Everybody's not middle class. We have high earners and low earners. So probably typical middle class right now, you'd probably be making anywhere from like $35,000 to $50,000 a year. That's just with the exchange rate. If you did 100 yen per one, it would probably be like 50 to 70. Typical work week would be 40 hours a week, but then there would be some overtime. And depending on your company, again, this changes depending on your company. So like, I know people that are like, yeah, my work is flexible. I work 2 days from home. As long as I get the results in, it doesn't matter. There's people like that. Straight up. They live close to me. I've been to his house. He's like, yeah, he works for a Japanese company. And then other people, I've got another guy that I know, he works like 18 hours a day. Okay, so it's not a one-size-fits-all thing. There is that. Yeah, don't trust everything you read on the internet. How's evangelism in Japan? I learned that some call it the graveyard of missionaries. Thank you, Janelli, for that question. So I typically talk about this. I'll talk about this in the evangelism module that we did a while back. I really hate that people call Japan the graveyard for missionaries. I think it's a misnomer. I think that people really need to rethink how they do it. It's just a lot of times people, especially from the West, they come to Japan with a Western mindset or paradigm on how ministry should be done. And they say, hey, I think, this is how we're going to do it. I've seen this work in America or Australia, et cetera, et cetera. Well, in Japan, it just takes time, okay? People don't have a concept of the one true God. They don't have any of that background. So we're moving them from like, instead of like a 0, we're moving them from like a -7 to a 10, and it takes a lot longer. And if you don't, sow and plow in faith and expect, then if you're expecting the same results in the same amount of time, it's going to not work. And so I think graveyard is a bad name for it. I think it just takes longer. The soil is harder, and you need to say, hey, it takes time, and I'm going to commit to that and wait for God to give us the harvest. And that's really what I think needs to happen. So graveyard, I don't like it. I don't like that term. I think it just takes time. It's just a different culture. It's a different culture. It's a different way of doing that and thinking through that. All right. Ms. Vicky talking about they're the rural older generation where we are in Hokkaido. Yes, and I didn't talk about that. They've had the Dankai, which is like World War II era baby. There's the Shirake Sedai, which is post-war. Shinjin, that's right basically before the bubble eras. And, the older generation, again, different thinking patterns. So different way of doing ministry there. Next, here's my question. Would the older generation favor having the gospel being communicated for its implicit values, whereas the younger generation would prefer how to gospel for all people? Again, it depends on who you're talking to. So I think it would be very hard to make that just label older generation this, younger generation that. But I think maybe how you communicate sin, how you communicate their need for the gospel, maybe how you go about sharing the gospel might look a little bit different with an older generation versus the younger generation. Because the gospel is God's saving power, and the gospel does not change. Just how we communicate that message might look a little bit more differently. All right, is there more need for evangelism in the city or the countryside, even though the countryside population is slowly shrinking? So, great. Go where God leads you, man. I have opinions about this. I think you should go to the city, and here's why. You go to the city because the younger generation in the countryside is mostly trying to get to the city. And then in their 40s, they do what's called a U-turn, and then they go back to the country. They're like, I'm kind of done with the city life. I want to go back home. So you could probably reach more people from more areas by being in a city than you can just going to the countryside. That being said, if you work in the countryside, God bless you, okay? Like, I'm not against you at all. And if you're like, no, I know for a fact God called me here, and I'm supposed to be here doing this work, great. I think it's awesome. It's just that cities tend to be a better place for new ideas to be accepted. Someone from a different group one time talked about being a foreigner in Japan and not only getting the gospel out, but he's like, who's going to be willing to listen to me as a foreigner? Is this person out in the country who's never seen, maybe even never seen a black person in their life, going to be open to this white dude talking to them about Jesus versus this person in the city? They're like, yeah, people come and go. I'm used to seeing foreigners. What you got to say? Who's open to hearing you? So I think cities are strategic. From here, we can send out. Movements happen in cities. Paul went to the cities. So I would recommend the city. But if God leads you elsewhere, great. We're not against you. Okay. All right, question. Are there opportunities to share the gospel and invite folks to church due to the polytheistic culture of Japan? I don't think that you would say polytheism is the reason why someone would come to church. A lot of times, if you just invite them to church, they're like, I'm not a Christian. It's like, we have our way of doing things, you have your way of doing things, and we don't want to really lump Jesus in with just one of the other gods. So we definitely don't do that. How we can share the gospel in Japan? We'll do a business good way. It could be share the gospel through business, making connections. That would be great. Again, it depends on how God is leading you. I don't think everybody needs to be a church planner. We need people to support them. And by support, I don't mean financially. I mean like as a team, helping out and working as as a team. Maybe if God calls you to Japan and you're like, no, I'm going to be in the workforce so I can share the gospel with these people and get them to church. Great. It's different for every person. Do you think there's a notable difference in prefecture culture, Abe Yamaguchi, has there become more of a Japan culture developed? That's Steven. Steven, thank you for that question. And yes, okay, so different areas, different cultures, different thinking. And we are in Nagoya, which has a little bit more of a traditional slant on stuff, but we're still a big city. I mean, we're the size of Houston, and that's 2.3 million people. People from surrounding regions flock to the city center here. But we're like, we're not Tokyo. So there's definitely that going on. Different prefectures have different views on things, and so different prefectures, different regions, you have to learn your area. If you think, yeah, I know Japanese culture, then you're going to miss out. All right. I feel like I've been called to Asia for some time. Do you have volunteer mission opportunities? Thank you. Go to our website, search for Reaching Japan, Recon Tour, and that info will come up. Do older or younger generations seem more open to the gospel in your experience? I think younger people, and when I say younger, I mean like under 35, would be more open to ideas about Japan. But there is an older generation, that's in their 70s and above that are like, hey, we watched this old movie with a guy named Charlton Heston called The Ten Commandments a long time ago. It's like a 3-hour black and white film. And they're like, that's cool. We like that. And we'd like to learn more about the Bible. So it, to be a Christian in Japan, do you still attend like going to temples at the start of the year or like different matsuris? So that is a great question. I'm not sure. Am I glitching? I think I might be glitching here. It might be my internet. Sorry about that. So I don't go to the shrine on New Year's to pray or to attend the festival to participate. That is idol worship. I think some people call it culture, but then you're still praying to the deity there. We do not do that. We pass out stuff in front of the shrine, say, hey, as you're making your New Year's prayers, why not learn about the real God you can pray to or the God of the Bible to pray to? We do that. So I try to be very careful, especially since, we know that idols are nothing, but then there's demonic forces at work. So we definitely shy away from that. Do you recommend any book for learning about Japanese culture and how it evolved with time? Try this one. This one's a little bit older, but The New Japan by David Matsumoto. He talks about the changes. This is 20 years old, by the way, but he does some research and talks about the changes that are happening in Japan. And I think it would be good to kind of balance out some of the other stuff out there. Do they allow gospel sharing in schools, like what we do in the Philippines, where there are times when we go to schools to share the gospel, invite people to Bible studies? There's a strong aversion towards that, as far as like religion in general, bringing that into schools. And so they're like, yeah, well, we can't do religious stuff. We are secular in our education, so you have to be careful. For those who are interested in missions to Japan, what do you recommend doing to prepare? Is there specific language prep or guides for this? There is, search for YWAM, YWAM, Japan, documentation. There's like a Wikipedia kind of article that they've put together. It has language learning, taxes, all that stuff. It's also linked to in our resources page on our website. Go there. They'll tell you about that and how to handle that. I would definitely look that up. All right, we've got a few more questions over on YouTube, so I want to jump through that. What year at PCC? I was there 2014 through 2018. I was there from 2011 to 2015, so we did overlap just a little bit. Have you noticed any positive or negative trend of the main religions in Japan? Living in the USA, it's a difficult thing to see, especially since we are focused more on Europe. Jesse, I'm not sure what you mean by that. So if you could maybe clarify what you mean by that, that was great. Steven, Instagram is glitching for me. Would you argue the Japanese are a bit more aware of Christianity because of globalism? And have you seen a negative impact of it? Negative, like false ideas of Christianity, like equating it to Western values, culture. Yes. So, yes and no. So, people are aware that Christianity exists, okay? It's not like people are like, what? What is a Jesus? Like, we don't really have that. They know that it's out there, they know it exists. But a lot of times their impression and understanding of what Christianity is supposed to look like might be a little off. So there is that. They think, everybody in America is Christian. They will think, hey, the Christians did the Crusades, they're terrible. And I'm like, yeah, that's not really what we would really identify as. And so I would talk to them about, some people, they claim to be Christian, but they're not really what the Bible says Christian. They're just like, you say you're Buddhist, but you're not really like representing the temple, right? Same way, these people claim to be Christians, and then they're like, yeah, no. So we do have to deal with some of that. All right, Carno, I'm curious, how much of the Bible should be conveyed using existing norms and understanding of Japan, and how much should be told more explicitly if that makes sense? Again, you have to adjust to who you're talking to. So what is their understanding? Because if you use words that people don't understand, then they're going to be like, you said a bunch of words. I don't know what you mean. So break it down, like almost like explain it to me like I'm 5. And I don't mean that in a demeaning way, but hey, this is what sin is. This is what the Bible says sin is. This is what the Bible means when the Bible says God. And this is who Jesus is. And here's how this all ties together. You want to explain that and ask them questions. And I really like to, in Japan, ask people questions about their background first, just so I know what their perspective and their angle on things is. Because maybe they have a family member that's a Jehovah's Witness. We don't know unless we ask. Hey, have you ever been to church before? Have you ever read a Bible before? What do you know about Jesus? Like, let's start there. And not just, again, this goes back to learning about that person. And, in the Yutori Sedai, the Yutori generation, they really tried to emphasize more individuality. There's still lots of group work and stuff, but, I went to this festival thing last year, and it was basically a bunch of Japanese hipsters, okay? And they're there, they're doing their thing. They've got like the earth tones going on. They've got the beanie and the overalls and everything, okay? And I'm like talking to these guys, and I was like, so like, what do you guys do? And they're like, well, we're actually just like Japanese salarymen. But on the weekends, they got their overalls on. They're like totally chill. They're on their own time and doing their own thing. So you've got to learn that person, because if you're like, oh, you're just like a white collar dude like everybody else, you're a corporate samurai, whatever, like, not necessarily. So you definitely want to learn that person and talk to them through that. All right. I think that's most of the questions that we've got here. Again, I am so sorry we've been having some technical difficulties. I've been recording this as well, so we'll probably try to throw that on YouTube just so the recorded version, because we're having some technical issues with the stream. But I do want to recommend that if you are considering missions and church planning and getting the gospel out, really, you want to be part of a team to do that, because if you're by yourself, you have spiritual gifts. God gifts believers with different gifts, and we all are supposed to function together. And there's all kinds of it's a strategic move to do this as a team. But I would like to show you what ministry in Japan looks like, and come to Japan for yourself. We have Spring Recon coming up in March. And we also have Summer Recon next year in June. Those are a week long. And you come, we show you Japan, show you what it's like. I'll point out some of these different discrepancies between what you've been seeing and what people actually do. So go through that. We've got a few more questions. I'll answer these, and then we'll wrap up for today. So, don't understand what the Crusades, Reconquista,